And because you are reading through the Constitution, a number of these I'm going to just touch on to give you a brief idea, but again, it would be important for you to do a little bit of your own digging into it. So begin here with the idea of popular sovereignty. This should be a review term for those of you that took U.S. history last year. So what does it mean to have popular sovereignty when it comes to our government? This is a pretty important one in our Constitution. David?
The people have the final say in that.
So the people have the final say. So the power resides in the people and their will. And so how does a government exist under a nation that is controlled by popular sovereignty? We talked about 4 theories of government, how governments are created. And so which of those 4 theories would most align itself with popular sovereignty? I know I'm asking you to connect stuff that you've done before, and teachers really shouldn't do that because that's not fair, right? So way back in chapter 1, I think it was, we talked about 4 theories. I've already heard from David. I want to hear from somebody else. Which of those 4 theories would most align itself with the idea of popular sovereignty or the powers within the people? Max?
Like the social contract.
Yes, exactly what I'm talking about. So social contract theory, where the people are willingly giving up their power to a government agency in exchange for the government doing what is best for the people. And so what do you suppose happens when the government stops doing what's best for the people? People get mad, absolutely. You feel like your rights have been violated, your unalienable rights. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson. And so then we start having discontent with the government. And the social contract begins to fall apart. Is that where we are today? I would say not yet. I would say we've got to be very careful with where we are. But understanding how our government works is an important first step in understanding and interpreting some of our social issues that we see on the news on a weekly or daily basis. So popular sovereignty is a really important principle in our Constitution. Limited government is another one. So unless you are a dictatorship, no government's going to be all-powerful. Every government is going to have limitations put upon it, generally by the people, or sometimes those limitations can be geographical limitations. You just can't have a massive navy because you don't have a port. You don't have access to waterways. You're landlocked. And so everyone has limitations. But when we're talking specifically here about power, governments are able to exercise a certain number of powers that are given to them or that they have taken over, depending upon that type of government. But when we're talking about the U.S. government, then we have given our government specifically expressed powers. And those powers are the ones that they are allowed to execute and allowed to perform underneath. And so we have intentionally limited our government to make sure that it does not get too large. And for our government, we have limited their government powers under the Constitution. And that's the idea of constitutionalism, that everything that our government does must be within the confines of the Constitution. So, does the government allow the United States, does the Constitution allow the United States to build up a nuclear arsenal and point all those nukes at North Korea? If you are Congress today, and let's just say that scenario is not playing out, okay? So don't go home and say, are we pointing our nukes at North Korea? No, not necessarily. Or at least President Trump's not saying so. But you are Congress, and this gets brought up before Congress that President Trump wants to double or triple our nuclear arsenal, and he wants to point all of them at North Korea. How many of you would say, yes, that's okay by the Constitution, we could do that? I see one hand, I see 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands, like a half a hand, some wimpy little like flags going up in the air. Like, I don't know. Okay. But if you had to say, yes, we're going to do that, okay? Some of you would say yes. How many would say, no, that is not in the Constitution. We should not do that. We're not allowed to do that by what the Constitution states. And again, I've got maybe one. Got a bunch of people that either I asked the question very vaguely, and so you're not understanding how to interpret the question, or you are not voting in an American government class, and I will continue to put that social pressure on you to vote in a government class. Well, it depends on your interpretation of the Constitution. We talked about strict and loose interpretation. So some would say, as Samuel pointed out, well, it doesn't forbid us from doing that, but it also doesn't tell us we can. So our government is essentially then, if the Constitution is silent on it, we've got to determine how we're going to interpret that. And we also have the rule of law. Our government officials are not above the law. They are still subjected to the same rules, same laws that we must follow. And I think it's pretty clear why that is included and a part of the United States, knowing where many of the framers of our Constitution came from. So watch the video here that talked a little bit about separation of powers and the checks and balances. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do want to touch on a couple of things when it comes to separation. We have three independent but co-equal branches of government, and you should know those three come quiz or test time down the road. And so if you're not familiar with what are our three branches of government, go back and reread this section and review through that. But they are also up here on the screen. So we have each of them separated. No one branch is more powerful than the other. Although we often hear about the presidency more than any other because it's one person and he runs a lot of the show. But he's just one of three parts of our Constitution. So it is separated and they are co-equal. And then we look at checks and balances. We are ensuring that no one of our branches of government becomes more powerful than the others. And there have been times in history where we have had to assert two of the branches to slow down the third. And they've had to step in, and this is why we have the check system to make sure that nobody goes beyond their bounds. So just for example, a few of them here. The president has the power to veto Congress. Congress writes a law that he does not agree with. He can deny that because according to our Constitution, laws have to be signed off by the president. Congress has the ability then to impeach the president and to take him through the proceedings that could eventually lead to his removal from office, should they go down those routes. And there are specific violations that would be cause for impeachment. I'm not going to go into that today, so maybe that's where you want to go with your Constitution reading project. I don't know. So Congress has the ability to impeach the president. And the Supreme Court then can also declare a law unconstitutional should the president and Congress be of the same political party and they write a law that is against the Constitution and they are hoping that nobody notices and hoping that it just flies through. That's where the Supreme Court comes in. They can say, no, guys, this does not work. And so we're going to make sure that this does not become law or we strike it out. There are a number of other ways we have checks and balances. This is just the most obvious and just a couple of examples to help us get started. Very rarely do we have direct confrontation between the three entities there, but sometimes we do. And there are times where we may have divided government, where we've got the legislative branch controlled by one political party, the executive branch controlled by another one. And it makes it really difficult for anything to pass by way of law, and it slows things down. I saw an interesting thing over the weekend that talked about gridlock. You guys know what gridlock is when it comes to politics? How would you explain that in your own words? What is, when you're in a traffic jam, why is that frustrating? Nobody's moving. You can't go anywhere. You're stuck. Okay? Some people call that gridlock. Well, political gridlock is like a traffic jam for bills and laws and things to happen between Congress and the presidency. And a lot of people criticize our government because we often get gridlocked, because we have different political parties involved. Nobody wants to move. Nobody wants to do anything. However, if we looked at the alternative, where everything went through really fast, we might put some very bad laws into place that we weren't really thinking through. So I don't necessarily think it's all that bad. Can be frustrating, yes, but I think that's part of the reason why we set up the way we did. Judicial review is another key element to our Constitution. I was just going to ask that if anybody picked up on that that's read through that. You're right, judicial review is not part of the Constitution, but it's an important principle of our Constitution. So how did it come about? Well, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here. Judicial review in and of itself is the Supreme Court's ability to interpret the constitutional validity of a law. So the Supreme Court can look at a law and they can determine, yes, that's constitutional, or no, that's not constitutional. But as David pointed out, it is not found in the Constitution. So where does it come from? How do we get there, David?
Marbury v. Madison.
Marbury versus Madison, yeah. And again, I think I'm jumping ahead of myself here on my screen. So it's not an express power of the Constitution. It's found in Marbury versus Madison. And what happens here from this major conflict in 1803 is that the Supreme Court steps in, takes power that nobody was really sure they had, but it becomes a precedent for all other cases going forward. So we need to back up a little U.S. history. What happened with Marbury and Madison? What's the scenario? 1803, who is leaving the White House? So 1803, you guys talk about the revolution of 1800. Okay, so that was Thomas Jefferson coming in. So we have John Adams leaving the White House. Remember John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, major rivals? They did not like each other. Those of you who have not taken U.S. history, this is one of those stories that often gets backed into the back parts of history books, unless you're taking AP. Then you guys talk about this, I would assume. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson don't like each other. What does John Adams do before he leaves? Knowing that his bitter rival is coming into the White House, what does he do? Well, he couldn't do anything about Congress because they were elected by the people. But what could he do as president before he leaves office? Yeah, the midnight appointments. So, election happens in November. In those days, we did not bring in the new president till March. He's got 5 months that he knows he can do some work here before that terrible guy Thomas Jefferson comes in. And so he can appoint people to government positions, and he still had Congress on his side at that point. And he started putting every Federalist into government positions that he possibly could. So he picked all his friends, he picked all the people who were loyal to him, he put them into office. He put them into judge positions, many of them in the high courts. And a lot of those positions could not be removed without impeaching that judge. A lot of them were life positions. And so he puts them in there, knowing that if he does that, Thomas Jefferson is going to just be shaking his head. He's not going to be able to get anything done. He's going to have to work with all these Federalists. And it was like John Adams' last little gut punch to Thomas Jefferson. By the way, those of you who are going to D.C., I've got a couple of stories about that rivalry regarding some of the paintings in the Capitol Rotunda that are quite interesting. I'll have to point out to you when we're there. But I don't have time here. So Marbury versus Madison, you've got a lot of guys that Thomas Jefferson appointed or had promised these appointed positions to that now all of a sudden have been filled. And Thomas Jefferson is going to come in as president. He's going to try to remove all the guys that John Adams had put into office during his last 5 months there. And it's going to go to the Supreme Court. Well, who has the power? Can Thomas Jefferson just come in and remove all these people, or do they have to stay put because John Adams put them into office? And it goes through the whole process, and Chief Justice John Marshall does not answer the question. And when it comes down to it, he essentially says, well, we are, as a Supreme Court, are going to make the decision that we have the ability to decide that the original law back in, I want to say it was 1794, maybe it was it might be the 1801. Sorry, I'm having connection issues here again. I think it was 1801, and he said, well, that was unconstitutional. And because he said that was unconstitutional, then it kind of made the whole argument a moot point. So, I think we're good now? Okay, yeah. So here we go. So I know there's a long story to tell us here why Marbury versus Madison is so important. It came down to John Marshall said that we as the Supreme Court can declare a president or a Congress's law unconstitutional, and therefore this whole Marbury versus Madison argument became null and void. There's also the idea of federalism, which by this point you should be familiar with the term federalism and know that it is a division of power between the national and state level. And our government runs based on a federalist model. So we have our states that are heavily involved, but we have a strong centralized government. And they are working together on a lot of things, but there are some things where states have their own rights and they have their own ability to make decisions. The Constitution in Amendment number 10 deals with some of those things that the states have as part of their power to be able to accomplish.